Hello and welcome to another episode of I Miss Book Club. I'm your host, Veronica Reynolds, and as always, co-hosted with Dana Munch. Good morning, Dana.
Hello.
So we have to start off today with a happy/sad announcement, which is that this is Dana's last episode at I Miss Book Club. She's moving on to greener pastures.
Yes, it is happy and sad and exciting and scary and all of the things. But this has been a very, very fun venture for me. And we've had a lot of good conversations. So happy to have done it, and we'll miss doing it.
And we'll miss you a lot too, Dana. I speak for the listeners as well. The podcast will continue. We'll just have some guest hosts in the meantime. But we just wanted to say at the top, congratulations, and we wish you all the best. But
thank you very much.
You're so welcome. And we have one more conversation to have, and we really wanted to have Dana go out on this conversation because I think it's a really lovely one to have as anyone who enjoys reading. We wanted to talk about the books that made us. We went through a lot of iterations of this idea. We were originally going to talk about books we didn't like, but we wanted to be a little bit more positive. And I don't think favorite is always the best word because sometimes our favorite books aren't the ones that had the deepest impact on us necessarily. And I thought talking about impactful books that probably changed how we are reading life, if not our entire lives, are probably worth discussing. So we're going to take turns talking about these really important books to us. And I hope that maybe encourages you to read some of them, or maybe deters you. I don't know what's on Dana's list. Mine are all positive, but...
Or mine.
All right. Do you want to start us off, Dana? What's your first book that made you?
Sure. So I just have to start out by saying that, I feel like my entire life has been built on books. I have always been a very voracious reader. You know, I was a kid that was in the library all the time. I read a lot of series as a kid, and actually I was going to start with one of those, but I couldn't exactly pick one title, and there were too many. But you know the types of series I'm talking about, like Goosebumps and Babysitter's Club and all of those types of things we of a certain generation were reading.
Oh, absolutely. Babysitter Club, I owned, I think, about 90 of those things. I probably bankrupted my parents with those books.
So I actually chose mine. I tried to choose books that sort of were indicative of certain periods of my life. So the first book that I chose when I was thinking of, what is the book that really defined my teenage years? And that book is Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. And this is one of the few books that I have read multiple times. I did read it later on as an adult, and it hits a little different. But I think, Perks of Being a Wallflower is basically a coming of age story. It was published in 1999, so it's based in that era. And it's basically just about this kid that's struggling through adolescence and teenagedom, and he's exposed to a lot of things. He's sort of like a naive kind of character and a little bit morose. And he gets, wrapped up with these friends, and good things happen, bad things happen, all the things happen. It was made into a movie much later, which I actually have never seen on purpose. I was like, I need this to just exist the way that it exists in my mind.
Fair.
The entire book is written in a series of letters. And I think even to this day, I still love books that have this sort of format. And I kind of think that it's related to having read this at the time. But I think I was also just a kid that was struggling through adolescence and teenagedom and being exposed to a lot of things at one time through friends that were older than me. And I think in a lot of ways I identified with the narrator, not to necessarily the extent of what is talked about in the book, because it does get very dark at times.
Yeah.
But I think I was just a very emotional person. So it really played on those strings for me. And I think about it even still very often.
It's funny because I'm sure this will happen as we're throughout this conversation. You're talking about that book, which made me think of a book I didn't put on my list. But Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret by Judy
Yeah.
Blume, which is like very much that book for me of like, this is exactly how I was feeling at that exact age. I think she's 12 in the book. And I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
that was me. It's when you're a tween or teenager, early teenager, I think finding yourself in a book was really impactful. And I think it's worth saying, even though we're not particularly old, I mean, we're both in our 30s, YA as a genre is relatively new and didn't
Yes.
exist the way it does now when we were teens.
Yeah, I think when I was younger and I was reading other books about kids, like, Boxcar Children or whatever, I didn't quite identify the same way because I like didn't really understand there were people other than children. Like, I think it was just a very like self-centered worldview. But then as a teen, it probably is like the first time that I really read a book that was like about kids my own age in a way that I was able to realize that,
Right.
the life I was living as a teen is very different from the life of adults around me,
Yeah.
and understanding that.
It's not to say there weren't YA books. Obviously, there were. Judy Blume
Yeah.
existed, and there was a lot of those books were like issue books. Like I was thinking, like Tiger Eyes. Did you ever read this? Just
No.
like dealing with a parent's death, or what to do when your friend gets into drugs. Like a lot of the books
Oh,
were like
yeah.
what adults wanted teens to know kind of books, or they were survival books like Hatchet. You
I
know,
was just gonna talk about Hatchet.
no, no, okay. I won't spoil it. We can save it.
Oh, no, no, it's not
Oh,
one of my books, but when you said survival, that's the one that I thought of.
I think everyone and like My Side of the Mountain, those kinds of things, like they
Yeah.
existed, but not to the extent where now when I think of a teen room full of a rainbow variety of stuff, like that's a relatively new occurrence, like the last 20 years or so. So I think our pickings for like really impactful YA books were slightly slimmer. I remember our summer reading lists having a lot of adult books on them.
Yeah, ours too, definitely. I mean, you had stuff like Catcher in the Rye or like there's some
How we
other ones
feel,
that I
you know
remember.
how I feel about
Yeah,
that.
we know how you feel about it. And there's some other ones that I remember from like, English class that had kids in them, but they're sort of escaping me. But I agree, they were more like, yeah, like tackling certain topics versus just this is a narration of the life of a
Absolutely.
teenager.
That's a good first pick.
Yeah.
My first pick's about rabbits.
Oh,
So,
I think I
which is
know.
a simplification, but my first book I picked was Watership Down by Richard Adams. It was written in 1972. I realized as I was like picking all these books, I didn't pick anything that was written after 1992, which was not on purpose. But Watership Down is a fascinating book. It's quite long. Most of the books I love are very long, I think because I was an escapist reader. So I wanted things I could like really dive into. And it follows a bunch of rabbits. It's literally, there's no human characters except on the periphery of this book, but it is not a childish book by any means, even though it was originally a story he was telling his daughters on a car trip. But it's pretty violent and it's also very heavy on mythology. The rabbits have an entire religion. They have a rabbit god named Elahera, who's the prince of 1,000 tricks, I think is his name. They have their own language, which is like woven throughout. And it's really an adventure story. They have to leave the warren they're in because there's a prophetic rabbit named Pippin who sees like the end coming. And it turns out what he sees is his vision is really about being destroyed because they're building a condo complex where their warren is. And it's quite lengthy and it's just their journey. And then they get there and they figure out they forgot to bring any lady rabbits, which, as you can imagine, is a bit of a problem. And so it's them kind of going out into the world and trying to figure that out. And they basically encounter like Rabbit Hitler. But it deals with like government in a surprisingly deep way about like how different, because they encounter a lot of different kinds of rabbit warrens on the way who are like dealing with different systems of being ruled and complacency. I mean, it's obviously being written in a very post World War II British way. Adams is a British writer, and it's like a lot about dealing with fascism, but it's all told through these like this very deep world building. And I think that's, for me, it wasn't like I wasn't like sitting there like I deeply relate to this rabbit, but it was like the first time I realized the power of metaphor in storytelling. I think I felt very smart reading it. I was, I think, 14, 15 the first time I read it, because I was like, I understand that there is a story under this story. And I read it so much that my first copy fell apart. So it's the only book I had to buy a second copy of in my entire life.
I love that.
Read my first copy to death, and the print's like this big. It's so tiny. But yeah, so that was my first pick, and it is about rabbits, but it is very powerfully about rabbits.
That is a book that I have actually never read. And I feel like it comes up all the time on like lists of every kind. And a lot of people that I know bring it up a lot, which is like kind of, it's like one of those things that seems to be circling around me. And maybe it's a sign that I should just get around to reading it. But yeah, it seems that most people who have read it really loved it.
I don't know about you, but I'm super defiant about stuff like that. The more someone recommends me something, the less likely I am to read or watch it. And if you're like, you will love this, I'm like, I am never gonna watch it. Not out of like meanness. There's just something contrary in me that like just is very resistant to that.
If they're too pushy, I can be that way. It's almost like they have to do like Jedi mind tricks on me to
Yes.
like,
Just like leave
make
it
it
in my
think it's my idea.
Yeah, exactly. Don't tell me what I'm gonna like. You don't know me. And inevitably, if I do try it, I like it. But I'm more like that with TV shows than books. But I'm just very resistant to trying new things.
Yeah, I find myself get more critical about it if someone has vehemently, recommended it, because I'm like, oh, you think it's so great? Am I really going to think this is great? And I'll like, be way more critical about like reading reviews about it or thinking about it before I even watch or read it. And it's like, why am I even doing this?
Yeah, I
Just
think
do it.
it's you just kind of like get up in arms a little bit, right? When someone's too pushy about it. But for what I would say about Watership Down, if anyone's interested in reading it, not all of the tropes translate well to the modern era, for sure. There's like a lot of kind of not great misogyny in it. But it is a fascinating thought experiment. And if you like mythology and you like world building in a really unusual way, it's for you. I mean, it's the mythology that he builds out around the rabbits is really deep, and it feels very fully realized, which is really hard to do. I've read a lot of fantasy and science fiction that has not managed to do that in a much easier set of circumstances. He really thought about like, what would a rabbit really believe in? Just quite an exercise. So what's your second pick, Dana?
So my second pick is something that I read as a young adult when I was in college, like early college. So I was probably like 20-ish. But the book is Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close by Jonathan Safran Foer, which was written in 2004. And it's like one of the iconic post 9/11 novels. And I actually this is his second book. I actually read his first book, Everything is Illuminated First, which sent me immediately to this book. And so they're actually very like conjoined in my brain because I read them so close together.
Right.
And of the two, I would say Everything is Illuminated is actually more of my favorite, but this book has stuck with me more. And the book is about a 9-year-old child named Oscar whose father dies in the 9/11 attacks, and he accidentally breaks a vase in his mother's closet and finds a key inside. The key says Black on it, so he assumes that this is associated with the key, and he goes through the phone book and tries to contact every person with the last name of Black in New York City, trying to like find out the mystery of this key. And it really is just a story of someone like moving through grief, but he's a child. And so there's a lot of things happening around him that he doesn't necessarily understand how it plays out. He lives with his mother, who is obviously grieving. She just lost her husband. His grandmother is also a prominent figure in it. There are parallels made to like the trauma that was left over from World War II for like his grandparents, that Foer kind of, it like throughout the book, you can just see how there's like the trauma that has been experienced and the grief that has been experienced is the same regardless of where you are in history. And there's just a lot going on, and it just has really stuck with me. The book also features a lot of like visual effects. Um, and there's just like this one photo in the book. It's very grim, of like a unidentified body sort of like falling out of a tower. And that image in particular is like burned into my brain. But I was 14 when 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
And I read, so this was written in 2004. And like I said, I read it later. So I was like 20. So I was like pretty decently removed from the event. But I think that like, I still just never really thought about the after effects of it. Like, it was very traumatic for everyone around me. And like, having moved through that weird space of something like extremely horrible happening to the country as a whole,
Yeah.
was, obviously I'm not alone in my feelings about this. Like, a lot of us had gone through this, but I think reading this book really kind of put me back in that space and allowed me to think more about it.
It was such a strange collective trauma, 9/11, because it was like radiating out how close to the event you were, right? Like
Yes.
the entire country felt it, but obviously there were degrees of how close you were, how
Mm-hmm.
cognizant you were of what was going on. And it takes a long time to process that. You know, I'm sure that the next few years are all going to have media of us trying to process COVID for similar reasons, right?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, and
Yeah.
that was a really difficult thing to move through. I was slightly older than you. I was 18. Um, I was driving home from RCC because we had been let out early, and I could see the smoke rising from the towers. I'll never forget that.
Gosh.
So creepy. And my mom told me to go get gas because she'd lived through like the gas crisis and everything, and she was
Mm.
like, she was sure that like you wouldn't be able to get gas for weeks. That was her first thought. And it is very strange, and coping with it in the aftermath when you aren't directly affected, but you still have to think about the grief of others, because there were kids in my high school who lost family members. I mean, very strange, very hard. And yeah, I can imagine a book helping you process that would be extremely helpful. Doesn't matter how much after the fact it came out, right?
Yeah. And the book is just really well written too. Like, I liked the stories that he meets like lots of different people, and there's sort of, these mini stories and mini relationships that are built within the book, which I really like too. So it definitely has like deep and dark themes, but there are also moments of like joy and humor and things like that. So
I remember
yeah, I
needing
really
that a
liked
lot. The humans are good actually theme is
it. Yeah.
really important after stuff like that. Ooh.
So what do you have next on deck?
Okay. So I'm still in young adult literature, such as it was at the time. Um, this book I actually read before Watership Down. I cheated a little. It is a series. It's a quartet, The Song of the Lioness by Tamara, which was written throughout the 80s. She wrote a second series, which I never read, that takes place in the same world. It's a fantasy series. But it was the very first book that I read that had the premise of girl pretends to be a boy to get the thing that she wants.
Ah.
And she has a twin brother, and they swap places because they're in the grief of losing their mother. Their father sends them away. She's supposed to go learn magic, and he's supposed to go become a knight. Neither of them want to do these things, so they swap places. Her brother's discovered pretty much almost immediately, which doesn't have very deep consequences on the book. But she has to live as a boy throughout being a page, and she becomes extremely close with the prince, who's also kind of serving in that capacity, although obviously with more privilege, learning to be a knight. And she uncovers a dark and horrible plot, which, she can save, and she has a connection with a goddess. It's all those fun YA tropes where like seemingly normal girl is actually super important. But it was the first time I'd had an experience where a book played with gender, like at all. I mean, Alana never identifies as a boy. She knows that she's a woman and is in fact frequently frustrated that she can't be herself necessarily. But she's so bold and brassy and courageous, and her femininity, once it finally is outed, does not hold her back. And it was also the first book I read where the girl does not wind up with the prince because there's multiple love interests, and she's allowed to explore that, which for like a book written for middle readers was like bananas to me.
Yeah.
She has multiple relationships. So she has a relationship with the prince. The curtain gets drawn, but there is an implication that they're intimate with each other. And she has a relationship with this kind of martial arts guy for a little bit, which doesn't work out because he's like actually wants her to be too masculine. He kind of wants her to, the ideal that she's been living up to, he wants her to live that. And she just realizes that's too far in the other direction for me. That's not who I am. And spoiler alert, if anyone hasn't read this 30-year-old YA series, she winds up with the Prince of Thieves, who she's known throughout her childhood. And it was just cool that she got to be an interesting, fully fleshed out person. She got to have multiple relationships, not wind up with the first guy that she fell in love with, which was such a thing in YA literature at the time. Yeah, they were extremely impactful on me because it was the first time I was like, I don't have to live gender roles the way they've been presented to me necessarily. I don't have to live that way, that there's characters in books who are going out and doing things and stretching themselves in other directions. Because I was growing up with that very 90s feminism where it's like girls can be anything, but not really.
Yes.
It was like spicy feminism.
Yeah, I was just gonna like talk about this a little bit. I feel like you and I are almost the same age, and like I had the same experience of like the 90s feminism of like girl power, but actually you kind of still need to stay in line. Like, so
right.
I feel
also like we will put one token girl into every team or like superhero thing, but her power is always the worst power. It's the least useful.
Yeah, right.
It's
and she's still like the mother.
Yeah. This happens still. You probably have experienced this as a mother in this day and age. Paw Patrol makes me incandescently angry.
Yeah.
There's one girl and she has the worst ability. Like,
and she never has her own episode. Like it's very rare to have like a Sky episode. They're always like, Chase or Marshall or one of the other ones.
And she's pink.
And she's pink. Yes,
like,
I know.
When will the day come when the girl character, it doesn't have to be like, and she's pink. So when you go to buy toys, you don't accidentally buy the silly girl toy.
I know. They did introduce Everest, who is like teal or aqua, but like she's like a very side. She's not even part of like the main team.
She's the snow one, right? Like
yeah, she's the snow one.
Yeah.
Oh,
winter emergencies only ever. Your season.
But to circle back to the book, I feel like I never read this. I probably would have loved it. I feel like I really latched on to characters who were like what I imagined to be a strong female to be. And they were almost always people who were like doing things that they weren't necessarily supposed to be doing, or that were like stretching the limits of what I thought was acceptable at the time based on the things that were being told to me.
Right. And what I thought was so interesting about this particular series, especially looking at retrospectively, not only is Alana a knight, which she's not supposed to be, but she's also still very much a woman. And there was like a theme of like strong female characters had to be either completely unfeminized, right? Like you have like Ripley and Alien, where it's like the fact that she's a woman is never really mentioned or touched, which is powerful in its own right. But like, it was very affirming to be like, this character is female. She does kick butt. She also has flaws. And her flaw is in that she's clumsy.
Yeah.
She's like impulsive and she doesn't communicate well with her friends all the time. She's suspicious, which gets her in trouble because she doesn't trust people the way she should, which gets her in trouble. I love impulsivity because I think that's usually a trait that's given to men. in books,
Mhm.
and like the fact that she was like an impulsive girl was really interesting to me. But anyway, I just liked the that complexity. I couldn't have put that into words probably when I was reading those books, but I will tell you I read them a million times. So what's your third
Um,
book?
so my third book is a book that I read pretty recently. It's a nonfiction pick. And the book is And Now We Have Everything on Motherhood Before I Was Ready by Megan O'Connell.
Ooh, okay. I'm tell me about this. I'm excited.
Yeah, so this book was written in 2018, in April of 2018. My son was born in November of 2017.
Mhm.
I think I read this like the next summer or fall. So, like, not that much after I had become a mom. And it's a short book, it's only 240 pages. And the book is about, like, obviously, like I said, it's nonfiction. So Megan O'Connell talks about how she like became unexpectedly pregnant and had the baby, and she just was like thrust into this new identity that she didn't necessarily choose for herself from the outset, but had come to, make the decision that she was going to be a mom. But even knowing that, she was not prepared for like any of the things that she faced. And she just talks about like having imposter syndrome as a mother,
Mm.
or like having to deal with postpartum bodily like image stuff, or this weird social push to make quote unquote mom friends,
Ooh,
and
yeah.
just like the strangeness of just being pushed into this new identity that you have no practice for beforehand. I don't totally align with all of the things that were in her experience or that she talks about after, but it was like I also had a bumpy introduction to motherhood and really struggled at times to acclimate. And this was like the most affirming thing that I read, and something that I really needed at the time, to hear that other people also think these things and feel these things. Because sometimes I think that you're thinking and feeling things and you're like, I don't know that this is, quote unquote right, or that this should be happening, or that
Right.
I don't think other people deal with this. And to know that that's not true was like a balm for me at the
Sure.
time.
We have a very um societal expectation of the glory of motherhood, I think, and I would call it almost toxic positivity around, especially the beginning of motherhood. It's certainly not something I probably would have told you about at the time, but because I try not to bum pregnant people out, but I had postpartum depression, and I had never had severe depression before, so I thought it was feeling sad, and I was not prepared for how numb I felt all the time. And I got through. I was working full time. My child was in daycare starting at 3 months. And I made it out the other side, but I really don't remember much of his first couple of months. And when I read other people's experiences, it was extremely comforting because I thought I had lost something and I was the only one who had ever lost it. You feel very isolated. And plus, you're so tired all the time,
Yeah, I know.
you know.
Yeah. It
Um,
makes for a weird brain soup afterward. And I have recommended this book to other women I know who were becoming first time moms, and I was like, you might not want to read it like in the hospital or directly when you get home. I don't even know that you would have the capacity to read anything
Yeah,
at that
I'm
time.
impressed by anyone who read anything. I fell asleep to the Serial podcast so many times that I only know 3 facts about that entire case because I kept being like, "I can at least listen to something," and then I would just pass out.
So, yeah. So, but like when your ability to read returns, and this book, like I said, was 240 pages. It took me a long time to read it because I had to read it like 2 pages at a time. But I do think it's like, I mean, it's very millennial ish, I could see that if you were of a different generation, it might not click as much as it does for people who are becoming parents now. Um, but I just thought it was so interesting, and it helped me so much just to realize other people had feelings like mine.
I think a book that makes you feel seen is the best kind of book, right?
Yeah, for sure.
The piggyback recommendation I would put on that, the one book I do recommend to people while they are still pregnant is Expecting Better by Emily Oster.
Yes.
Which is she's a statistician, specifically a medical statistician by trade. And when she became pregnant, she was shocked by how little her OBGYN had to back up the things that he was telling her she couldn't do. So she looked at the studies herself, and each chapter kind of tackles one of these pregnancy things, like don't eat, raw cheeses or whatever, whatever thing it was. And she looked into how realistic was this prohibition, because obviously you're not allowed to run experiments on pregnant people. That's horrific.
Right.
So there's a lot of these things are self-reported, or they're very tiny studies by people who volunteer, their experience. And one that will stick with me forever is the study that said you shouldn't drink coffee while you were pregnant. Is a very small study that was based on, and about half of it, I think it's been a while since I read it, so I might be exaggerating, but it was like a good chunk of the participants said that they were drinking coffee during their pregnancy and had bad outcomes, but also said that they were doing cocaine.
Oh my God.
So that's worth a read if you're pregnant and you're very, like me, we're extremely nervous that you were going to put the wrong thing in your mouth. Read Expecting Better. Some of the stuff is absolutely borne out by the studies, and some of it a little more questionable. And you may feel a little bit better if you needed to have half a cup of coffee in the morning. You feel like maybe we're the sleepiest pregnant person ever. But anything about postpartum stuff, it just hits like a hammer. It's really critical stuff. Ooh.
Yeah, and I think it's not really talked about in a lot of ways too. Like you're saying, not to like restart this whole thing, but like you said, I agree. It does kind of veer into toxic positivity. And I also understand you don't want to like scare people, right? Like it's kind of it's a scary time to begin with. Like you're not totally in control of what is happening to your body. Like during the pregnancy, you can only do so much. And it is unnerving in a lot of ways, and you wouldn't want to add to that either. But I also think that it leaves people a little bit ill prepared for when things don't go exactly how you imagine them to go, or exactly the way that you see other people presenting it as, which I don't even think is the real story most of the time anyway. And it leaves you feeling alone. But we can move on. So what's your next one?
Oh, I have a real uplifting one. It's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn.
Oh, good.
So Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith was written in 1943. It's a semi-autobiographical book. It centers on, I'm going to say her name wrong. Is it Franny or Francie? I think it's Francie. This is one of my favorite books. I just haven't read it in the last year, so some of the details are fuzzed out for me. But there are parts of this book that are so stuck onto my soul that I can practically recite them from memory. It just follows a little girl growing up in Brooklyn, in the early 1900s, and her life is difficult. They're very poor. Her father dies of alcoholism, basically. I think the only book I can think of where an alcoholic parent is portrayed really lovingly. Because he's not abusive, he's not yelling at anybody, he's negligent. It definitely makes their family life harder because he can't work consistently. But she loves him so much. He's still considered a great parent to her in many ways. His loss is very devastating to her. And it was a very nuanced take on a lot of things that were going on. And I will say, probably influenced me becoming a librarian, because even though the librarian in the book is not very nice, the book opens with her reading library books on the balcony under this umbrella tree, which she describes as the tree that grows in Brooklyn is this tenacious weed tree that will just grow anywhere, and you can cut it down and it grows back. And of course, it's a whole metaphor for her entire life of growing this fertile soil. It's a great period piece, although obviously when it was written, it wasn't so much a period piece. She was writing about her own childhood, but now it's this really beautiful bubble of Brooklyn at that time. but it's also just a very tender story about her entire life. I can't even say it's coming of age. I think she's like elementary. She is elementary age when it starts, and it ends with her as a young woman and the journey that she takes. And it is one of those classic books that I do think entirely deserves to be a classic and should be read by like everyone, because it just covers a huge gamut of human experience. And she's a very relatable character, and it's not rosy about what poverty looks like. It's not grim either. Like, they're just people living their lives, and there's beautiful things about it, and there's harsh things about it. And she's very clear that more money would just make her life easier. And you totally agree with her. Like, it's not
Yeah.
um, some of these things where she's like, but I'm so glad. And they do talk about later in the book that in a way they're glad they grew up the way they grew up because it made them grateful for things. But they're also very happy, her and her brother, because they have a very young sibling by the end of it, that their sibling won't grow up without all of that. Which I think is a very real look at poverty. I think especially in young adult literature, poverty is either totally romanticized or it's the worst possible, like everything is grim. And this is somewhere in the middle where you still have a supportive family and people that love you and you can still survive it. But it's difficult and it makes their life very hard. It's extremely poignant. I think about them buying the plot with the father's grave plot with the money they were setting aside to buy land, like all of the time. I don't know if you read Tree Grows in Brooklyn.
I read it when I was young, and I don't remember a lot about it at this point.
Yeah, it's totally fair. It just struck me at the right time. She was a voracious reader, which I think any kid picking up a book who likes to read is like, my people. She reads through the scenes in the library are fascinating to me because she sets up she has this desire that she's going to read every book in the library alphabetical by author. Which at the time I was like, goals.
Can I do that?
Right, I'm going to do that. Of course, I think her library was a little smaller than the one that I grew up with. But yeah, very impactful book. I bring it up all the time. Joe's book club did it 2 years ago, and I showed up because he was worried that no one would come. And I was like, I will talk about this book with you.
I have so much to say.
I did. I hadn't even read it recently, and I had my copy, and I was like, I'm ready. We did have a very nice conversation about it we did have another participant. But just a book that I just adore, and it really talks about how a good book can stand the testament of time, because this book is 80 years old.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I don't have any deeper thoughts about it. I just love it.
And that's fair. I mean, like, it was interesting trying to put a list together for this episode because there were so I went through my Goodreads, which I have been a Goodreads user for so long. So I have like years upon years of things that I read. And I was like, let me see like what things I'm maybe forgetting. And there were so many books that I was like, oh, this book, like books I loved so much. But then when, I had a list and I whittled the list and I'm like, I don't know that these books really like changed me. I just loved them. And there were some of the books are like, this stuck with me and it wasn't necessarily something I liked that much. Like none of those really made it to my list, but it was odd to think about the things that really stick with you. And like, sometimes there just are those things that stick with you, and it's like, it could be just a true love of the story. And I think that's valid in and of itself.
Yeah, I think the reason Tree Grows in Brooklyn is on my list, even though I can't pinpoint like one thing, is because it's everything. I think it was a book that was about surviving and thriving in difficult circumstances, but wasn't in the context of something. I think a lot of the books I was reading at that time, terrible trauma happens, right? Like it is an apocalypse or it's the Holocaust, all of these horrible, horrible things, slavery. And the Tree Grows in Brooklyn, she's just poor. Like, it's just, her life is just difficult because it is. Obviously her father dying is like a horrible event, but that's already like probably, I think 100 pages into the book. It's not right away. And it's also not just about it retells the love story between her parents, because by the time the father dies, obviously the mom is quite fed up with him. understandably, but she also mourns him a great deal. And you know why, because you see how they fell in love, and it's so charming and so lovely how they find each other. And I will also say I'm a grandchild of immigrants, and it's a story that doesn't get explored as much because you're not being even raised by immigrants, but that impact comes down the line. It doesn't stop just because it's a generation removed, you know.
Right. Yeah.
So I related to her a lot. Even though, you know, obviously it was a different immigration experience and for different reasons. I don't know. It was, I think sometimes the book is just, it sees you. I think that's what I was trying to say. Like I had nothing in common with this girl really, but I felt like the book was about me. Do you know what I mean? Like you're like, oh
Yes.
this book is about me. And that's, so I know we both went a little over. We originally said 3 books, and I know we brought extras. Do we want to do?
We did bring extras, like the runner-ups.
Do we want to do like a dash through some of the extras? Do you want to share 1 or 2 of your extras?
Sure. So one of my other extras is this book that I find myself talking about all the time. It's another nonfiction. It's called Running with Sherman by Christopher Mcdougall. And this author is also the author of the book Born to Run, which is like a very iconic book about running. But Running with Sherman is like one of the most heartwarming, feel good books I have ever read. And I feel like a lot of nonfiction that I read specifically is not necessarily sunshiny. And I am a runner, so I am apt to pick up any book about running because it's like my 2 big loves married together. But this book is like, it has everything in it. And basically it's like, the author lives in Pennsylvania Amish country, and they have like this big homestead there. And one of their neighbors has like this donkey that is totally neglected, and he kind of gets roped into rescuing the donkey. So he brings the donkey back to his, we'll just call it a farm, but it's like his home. And the donkey has like really overgrown hooves, and its hair is falling out, and it's like totally dejected and like this depressed animal. And he nurses him back to life, but he's not really like doing great. And someone else in the community tells him that donkeys really thrive when they have something to do. Mm-hmm. And so the author is also a runner. So he decides that he's going to enter the World Championship burro race, which takes place in Colorado. And it's a 29-mile race where you run with your donkey.
Oh my God.
And
so
yes. So the book is about like how he has to train this donkey how to run, and they have to like, it's stubborn and it's never done this before, and it's like learning to trust humans again. He has to recruit other animals from his farm to like helps like emotionally support the donkey, and he needs help from other people in the community to even learn like what to do with this animal because he doesn't really know. And it goes through and just has like so much of everything. Like at the end of it, I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm adopting a donkey tomorrow. Like that's just like you learn so much about like donkeys, which seems very like specific. There's a bunch of running stuff. There's a bunch of stuff about the Amish community, and they have like this nighttime run that they do that was like very fascinating to me. And it just is like, has so many themes in it. I really think that it would be appealing to most readers, even though it seems like, oh, it's just a book about running or animals, which doesn't necessarily, I could see that not being appealing for certain people. But because of the themes in it, and there's like all these little like alleyways of topics and tangents and things, it's just like a really nice read.
That sounds like right up my alley, because I love narrative nonfiction where you also learn something about like something.
Yes.
There's a really great Netflix series called We Are the Champions. I think that's its title. Have you watched this?
No.
You might get a really big kick out of it. It's only a couple episodes, and each episode is like a mini documentary, and it concentrates on like an unusual contest. So there's like, do you know about the cheese rolling?
Yes, I do actually.
So they have an episode about the cheese rolling race, and they have an episode about dog dancing, which is probably my favorite.
Okay.
And it feels very in line with this, where it's like a really unusual thing, but it's just humans out there being cool and humaning and being interested in like something really specific and odd, but also really lovely. And I love those stories.
Yeah, you should read it. I'm always talking about this. I think about it all the time.
I'm gonna read it because I
For
love the
so
sound
many
of it. That is
reasons.
like so to piggyback on you, is one of my nonfiction books that my only nonfiction book that is on my short list is The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. And
Yep.
you know, I'm a horror reader, which of course dovetails with true crime, which I do have some mixed feelings about these days. But I uphold The Devil in the White City is not like a modern true crime book where it's like maybe not always taking the victims in mind so much. Larson is like an exhaustive researcher. All of his books are really great. I love all of them. I just read Dead Week, which is about the end of the Lusitania, which I really recommend.
Mhm.
But he does this thing. He has 3 or 4 books like this where he takes like a crime that he follows all the way through, but he mixes it with the world event that's going on. And in this case, it's oh, I'm gonna forget the guy's name. Mudson, I forget his actual name. Anyway, horrible serial killer. But the reason he's able to thrive and not be caught is he's in Chicago at the same time that the World's Fair is happening. And they also go into immense detail about the World's Fair and just mind blowing stuff about the invention of the Ferris wheel and like the way they were exploiting people from other countries as like sideshows, basically, and the sheer amount of people who are flowing through Chicago at that time, which, like, if you think about it, of course, lots of people could take advantage of, not just a serial killer. So, like, the
Mhm.
serial killer story is interesting. He's considered like America's first serial killer. Um, they just tried to dig him up recently to do more DNA testing on him. The guy's been dead for like 100 years. And H. Holmes is the name that he operated under. Um, so it's one of those books where even if you're not super invested in true crime, it's really about the World's Fair and like just what the people behind it thought. It has a whole section about how Central Park got started because one of the guys who worked on Central Park is also involved in the World's Fair.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I did not start reading nonfiction until like not that long ago.
Yeah.
Um, because I guess I just had this idea that it was like boring and I like love novels and stories and all that kind of stuff. And I don't even know what the first nonfiction I read was. I couldn't tell you, but once I realized narrative nonfiction was a thing and that
Right.
you could still be told a story, but oh, by the way, it's true and there's a bunch of like cool stuff that happens, I was sold. And now I read like a pretty decent amount of nonfiction.
So I still don't read a ton, but I do love it. And I can tell you the first nonfiction book that changed my mind. I do remember it because it probably changed everyone's mind. It was an international bestseller, but Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil was the one that I
Mm.
read. And I was like, oh my God. I mean, I think I probably read it like 20 years after publication. But if there's someone out there who hasn't read Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, I can't recommend it strongly. Um, and then I started reading Mary Roach, who, if you haven't read her, is
Oh yeah, I've read some of
terrible.
her things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you need to feel like if you're worried about death, Stiff is just that was her first big book, and she really just talks about what happens to people after they die, which sounds really grim, but she's such a funny writer, and she like pursues this
Yeah.
down such weird alleyways, and she talks about herself in the first person. John Ronson does that too. But I could go off on about narrative nonfiction forever. It's great. Supposed to say that we should do an episode about that, but that'll be my problem. Anyway,
Oh no.
sorry. Um, Oh, so one of my other ones on my honorable mention list, totally not narrative nonfiction, the complete absolute opposite of narrative nonfiction is Magica by Clive Barker. And the
Oh.
reason I put this on the list is Clive Barker, probably one of my all-time favorite authors, first of all. Also, that's how I got into horror because I'd been reading Stephen King. To be fair, I got into horror because of Christopher Pike in like 4th grade. I always liked it. I was the first one to read Christopher Pike, and it was the only time I was a radical in my class because everyone was still reading R.L. Stine, and I was reading Christopher Pike, who was like a little racier and written for like slightly older kids. But Clive Barker was the first time I read horror that wasn't just horrific; like there was other things happening. Magica is almost 900 pages long. Like, it is an epic. My copy of it could like kill a man. It's huge, the hardcover. But because that's how he writes. All his books are a million pages long, but extremely rich world building and extremely philosophical, like just a really thoughtful book about how dreaming impacts our real lives, which is something Barker is like obsessed with. Weave World is about that too. The Great and Secret Show is basically about that. And he was the first writer where I felt like I was under a spell when I was reading the book. Like, I just, not only was I transported, I was not even thinking the way I normally think when I read his books. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
You know, it just changed.
Yeah. I feel like sometimes, I feel like, oh, this is like such a weird way to put it. It's like my brain has been like hijacked by the language in the book. And it's almost like my thoughts morph into whatever style the language is of the book. And it's like, you're just totally in it.
Yeah, it's like a real consciousness expander, right? Like, you're just kind of gone. I mean, when the prose are that good, because there's some books where you're like, you are present in yourself the entire time and you are like, the experience is reading it. And then there's some books that, like, I was thinking when people say it really sucked me in, I was thinking of like, you kind of disassociate into whatever you're reading, which was something that was easy for me to do as a kid and is very hard for me to do as an adult. And Barker still reliably can do that to me. He doesn't write much anymore. He has a chronic illness. But I love him. I couldn't do a list without Clive.
Yeah. And this is actually relevant to my other runner-up, which is Ordinary Grace by William Kent Krueger. And this book is about, it takes place in 1961 in Minnesota, in like this small town, and it's about this brother pair. And there are 4 deaths throughout the summer. The younger brother has like a pretty significant stutter. And so the older brother is always kind of like translating for him. But the younger brother is like very wise beyond his years, but it's told from the point of view of the older brother as an adult. And so he's reflecting back on this summer and he's sort of realizing the things that were happening around him and what they actually meant. But as a child, he was just kind of like called to inhabit a more adult status based on the things that were happening. So like secrets and betrayal and adultery, and obviously these mysterious deaths and murders that were happening. And it's like a coming of age story. But when I read this, was totally sucked in, and I was like in love with the way that it was written and the language style. And I think it's like one of the first books that I really like was aware of like language as an important feature, because I think before this I was really just reading things like, oh, I like this story, or like, oh, this sounds interesting. And I was probably a little late to the game on the language aspect of things because like I said, I was in grad school, but I was like, oh my gosh, like this is incredible. And I've since read some of his other things and have loved them too. But this book I love so much. And I also recommend it to people a lot because it seems to have a pretty wide appeal for people as well.
So I'll say my last one, which is not a book I recommend to anyone else, not because it's bad, just because the impact it had on me was very specific and I don't think it would work for most people. But I was with my mom up in Woodbury Harriman, where there used to be a discount bookstore, which was all like the cut books that like no one could sell. And they would be like $1. And my mom would love to take me there because she could buy me like 8 books, which would get me through like 20 minutes, and it was cheap. And bless her, she would take me there fairly regularly. And I got this book called Is Data Human? The Metaphysics of Star Trek, which you collected the philosophy section, you know, is really common. There's these like pop culture philosophy books where they're like, I'll teach you philosophy through like a pop culture window. And Star Trek is really prime for this because it's already a really philosophical show to begin with. Like, that's what it likes to do, is kind of pose philosophical questions. And this book changed my life. It's probably, to be fair, should be number 1 because it is the book that had the most obvious impact on who I became. Because of this book, I read it when I was 15. I did an incomprehensible book report on it for school. trying to explain metaphysics to other freshmen high schoolers when I barely understood it myself.
I
And
love this.
it's the reason I was a philosophy major in college. It changed
Oh,
my
I don't think
entire
I knew that
trajectory.
about you.
Yeah, I am one of those librarians like you who is not an English major, which is a very rare breed. I was an English minor. I was close. But I became obsessed with philosophy in high school. I read a lot of stuff that went way over my head because obviously books like Metaphysics of Star Trek are simplified for lay people. And I did not understand what I was reading half of the time, but it's the reason I am the way I am. I think it really, that book actually changed the trajectory of my life, like in a manifest, obvious way. It probably should have been number one, but I just don't find it to be very relatable when I talk to other people about it.
Yeah, but that's incredible. And I love that it's sort of this, it's to me, it seems like this kind of niche
Oh
like
yeah. It doesn't get more niche
interest.
than that. Metaphysics isn't even like a general philosophy idea. It's like a
Yeah.
specific
It's
band of
like,
philosophy.
and then applied to Star Trek, which is also a very specific thing.
Yeah, it's
So
like
I love that
nerdy
this
nerd.
one thing sort of like tipped the scale for you and sent
Oh,
you down a different road.
and it is one of the books that inarguably did that. Like I can probably make an argument for like, well, this book made me think this way. This book suggested things to me. But I can tell you, I remember reading this book being like, this is what I want to do. Also a good example that doesn't mean that's necessarily what you're going to do. Because
Yeah.
I'm a librarian now.
Yeah. Oh, well, something else maybe tipped your scale later.
Yeah, it was called Getting a Doctorate was extremely expensive.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I love librarianship, don't get me wrong, but yeah, it's a road not taken for me for sure. But
Yeah.
I still think about that book all the time because I think that's the question I ask about a lot of books, and I think the books I like the most are really always asking the question, what is a human being?
Hmm.
What makes us human? I think that's at the root of so many discussions about books that we've already had, you know.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So do you have any last books that you want to rattle off before we move to that?
Not particularly. I mean, there are so many books that I have loved or that I can remember so specifically the when and the where of reading them and the mindset that I was in at the time. But I don't know that the ones I had mentioned are ones that really like grabbed me in a certain way or like made me read more consciously aware of certain things or help me process certain things. Actually, I think all of my top three that I mentioned were just books that help me process life.
Yeah.
Um, and that's, just one of the many things that reading can do for us.
I find the books that I chose have given me language to talk about things that have happened to me. You know, the Tree Grows in Brooklyn, I mention all the time because the way that she puts certain scenarios articulate something I think better than I could articulate them.
Yeah.
It gives me, not to get Star Trek on you, but there's an episode in the original series where they encounter this group of aliens who only speak in stories. So they can only, everything is a metaphor. So when they're trying to explain, like, we have to go do something hard, they'll see like Damarok and Anakin on the mountain in reference to like a past story. And I feel like that's what the great books do for me, is give me these metaphors so I can communicate more effectively, even to people who haven't read those books necessarily.
Yeah. And this is just making me think about the reading builds empathy thing, because I think you're right. I think it lends you language to be able to better describe and understand your own experiences, which in turn helps you understand other people's experiences as well. And obviously, when you're reading, you're kind of ingesting these stories that you wouldn't necessarily experience for yourself. But I really think that the self understanding is, you know, extremely helpful in identifying other ways that people live and other ways that people think, and you have more language to grasp it and discuss it.
And find the ways that you're the same, right?
Yes,
Because I think the
yes.
books that work the best that way are books that you do see yourself in through somebody who's going through something that you've never gone through, or is someone that you'll never be. You know, I saw a really interesting article when I was looking for something else recently, and it talked about reading as a mirror and reading as a window.
Mm.
And I think the best books are both at the same time, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I'm never going to be a rabbit, but I am going to have to
Are you
face,
sure? No.
I mean, you know, depends on your belief system, I guess. But I might have to face a situation where society itself has turned against me and have to figure out how to navigate that.
Mhm.
You know, it's, yeah, it's a window, it's a mirror, it's empathy building, it's your philosophy major.
I know. We just love reading so much.
We do, and I can't think of a better way to say not goodbye, but so long for now, Dana.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on this journey with me.
It has been very fun. I have really, really enjoyed it. I really liked having the outlet to talk about reading this way, which is not necessarily something that I get to have all the time. I love the weird and wonderful ways our conversations have gone, and it's been very fun.
It's been lovely, and who knows, maybe you'll come back to us as a guest host down the line.
Oh, I would love.
Amazing. So thank you so much, Dana. Thanks to our listeners. Like I said, the podcast will continue. It'll just sound a little different. But thank you all for coming with us this far. And we'll see you again soon.
Sounds good to me.
All right, everybody, read on.